Hello, I'm Luciana Spraker, Director of the Cities of Savannah's Municipal Archives, and I want to welcome you to another installment of our Hungry for History series. Today, I'm joined by Harry DeLorme, Director of Education and Senior Curator for Telfair Museums, who is going to share with us the wonderful work of William O. Golding. Before we dive into Golding's work, I want to provide you with a little background on our presenter. Harry DeLorme Jr. is a curator, educator, and visual artist with 30 years experience as a museum professional. Mr. DeLorme holds BFA and MFA degrees in drawing and painting from the University of Georgia and received training for museum educators at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He began his work in museums at the Georgia Museum of Art and is the Director of Education and Senior Curator for Telfair Museums, where he oversees and develops educational programs and resources for audiences of all ages, including lectures, festivals, school programs, a hands-on family learning space, and an interactive technology gallery. As a curator, he has organized exhibitions of Southern artists, as well as exhibitions of art connected to Savannah's history. These include Port City, the Savannah Riverfront through artists' eyes, Bonaventure, a historic cemetery and art, and the inspiration for today's talk, the art of William O. Golding, Hard Knocks, Hardships, and Lots of Experience, which is now on display at the Jepson Center through August 28, 2022. Harry created and curates Telfair Museum's annual Pulse Art and Technology Festival, which is one of only a few events of its kind in the United States. Mr. DeLorme also served as an adjunct instructor for studio art for 14 years at Armstrong State University and is an active studio artist who has exhibited nationally and internationally for more than 30 years. We're happy to have him with us today. And with that, I'll now turn it over to Harry DeLorme.
Well, thank you, Luciana, for inviting me to do this program today. I'm here to talk about an artist I'm really excited about. And I'm here really to tell a story that is both connected to Savannah, but it's also a global story. And it's the story of one of the most significant artists, I think, to have worked in this city, although his name may not be familiar to a lot of folks and certainly not as familiar as it should be. So let's talk a little bit about this artist today, the artist known as William O. Golding. Golding, who was born in 1874 and died in 1943, was an African-American artist and seaman who made drawings of ships and international ports while he was a patient at Savannah's Marine Hospital in the 1930s. His drawings are in museum collections nationally, including the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the American Folk Art Museum in New York, the Williams College Museum of Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and several others. Fortunately, Telfair Museums here in Savannah and the Morris Museum in Augusta, Georgia, have the two largest collections of his work. So it's nice to have his work here in Georgia, where he made all of his work. All of it was made actually right here in Savannah. And we're currently celebrating his work in the largest exhibition ever mounted of his drawings here at the Jepson Center through August 28th of this year, 2022, and we're offering free admission to all local residents every Saturday and Sunday while the exhibition is on view at the Jepson Center. So let's begin the story, and the story doesn't begin in Savannah proper, but not far away in Liberty County in 1874, where William O. Golding is born. And I'm using the name Golding, but the name Golding in Liberty County is often interchangeable with Golden and other spellings. And you see that in the case of his adoptive father and in the case of William O. Golding or Golden himself. William O. Golding was first comes to light in the 1880 census for Liberty County, where he's shown as the adopted son of William A. Golding or Golden, William Anthony Golding, who was really quite a well-known man at the time. He was one of the original 33 Black lawmakers, legislators in the state of Georgia. Although by the time the younger William was around, he was no longer in that position. William Anthony Golding was a very well-known man in his community and someone who made quite a difference, not only for his work as a legislator, but as the founder of the historic Dorchester School, or what would become the Dorchester Academy, which exists as a museum site today in Midway, Georgia. William Anthony Golden was also a preacher in addition to being a legislator and an educator, and he preached for a time at the historic Midway Church, which you see in the image on the left. Now, we don't know the exact circumstances that brought young William O. Golding to Savannah, but it was, however he got here, probably with his adoptive father, perhaps other family members. His father was said to have worked in Savannah, possibly at the time. But in any case, young William O. was exploring the Savannah waterfront with his cousin sometime between 1880 and 1882, when something quite traumatic happened. And here I'm going to give you William O. Golding's actual words, because his story is incredibly poignant. It's a story almost worthy of a film. It's almost hard to believe in its scope. But I'd like to give you his words because I think it's important to hear his voice. So I'm going to read a brief note about him while you sort of look at this image of the Savannah harbor from the early 1880s to kind of set the stage for you. In 1932, William O. Golding, then in the Marine Hospital in Savannah, writes a letter to a woman named Margaret Stiles, who's been helping him, encouraging him to make his art. And he writes to her about his early experiences, how he left Savannah, and what happened next. He says, "Miss Stiles, you wanted me to draw a picture of the ship that took me from Savannah when I was a boy. I'm sending a drawing of her. Her name is the Wandering Jew of Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, a three-masted ship, tons 1,800, commanded by Captain William O. Potter, brother of Captain John Potter, who owns and sails the ship Minister of Marine. On the 15th of July, 1882, I went with my cousin down to the bluff, better known now as the coastline wharves, passing astern of the ship. The captain and his wife was walking the quarterdeck this morning. When I went down there, I heard the captain ask his wife, 'Now, Polly, you always said that you wanted a boy. Now there are two of them. Pick your choice, which one of them you will take.' She says, 'I will take that little fat boy with the pretty nice white teeth,' meaning me. So the captain calls me and I went on board and they took me down into the cabin and made much of me. But when I wanted to go back ashore, I found that I could not, for the very reason that I was out at sea about 45 or 50 miles offshore. When I came up on deck, I saw a man standing by a big wheel. I asked him, 'What light is that?' And he told me that it is Savannah light, Tybee light. And that is the way how I left home on the ship. I never saw home again until May 25th, 1904. I came back home to Savannah. And all that time since I left home, I have been all over the world, from north, south, east, and west, in plenty of ports in the seven seas, from England to China, Japan, India, Australia, Africa, West Indies, Central America, South America, around Cape Horn 23 times, Cape of Good Hope 25 or 30 times. I am old now, 59 years old, can't get along like I used to on the ship, so I have to give up going to sea. Now I only go to sea in my sleep and get among other old shellbacks and swap yarns of old times is all I can do now. Well, 49 years is long enough to be going to sea. All that time, I never accumulate any fortune, but hard knocks, hardships, and lots of experience. Was in all kinds of ships from a whaler to a man of war. So I've had my time knocking around the world." It's an unbelievable story. And clearly he was a practiced storyteller. In fact, he was known at the Marine Hospital by the nickname Deep Sea. And as he mentions in his letter, he enjoyed swapping yarns of seagoing with other former sailors, merchant mariners, and veterans at the Marine Hospital. Let's take a look, though, at his story. Not all of it quite matches up with the facts, possibly because he was so young at the time that he left Savannah. Now, I couldn't find the ship that he noted leaving on July 15th, 1882. There was no ship by that name in the Savannah registry. However, there was a ship by that name in Savannah on July 15th, 1880, some 2 years earlier, meaning that William O. Golding may have been as young as 6.5 years of age when he was lured aboard a ship and left Savannah. We don't know what he did during those early years. He did do a couple of drawings of the ship that he said took him from the city, which he said was from Canada, from Nova Scotia. And again, as I pointed out, I found another ship of the same name, the same date, but 2 years earlier, and that's the one on the right, which was actually not from Canada, but from Long Island, from New York. And it's possible that he either left on the ship that you see on the right, or on another ship, perhaps a Canadian ship after all, and merely changed the name of it later. After all, he's writing the story, 50 years later. And so it's possible that that some of the facts, didn't quite all match up, in his memory, having experienced some of these things as a very young child. But he does do these autobiographical drawings, and we're going to see this. His drawings chronicle ships that he saw, ships that he heard about, as well as ports around the world that he may have visited or heard about. And moving along, as I mentioned, we really don't know a whole lot about his early life. We know that he left Savannah at a very young age. He likely engaged in work aboard ship as a cabin boy, perhaps grew up on ships, learned other duties, and then he turns up in the record at the age of 18 when he enlists in the US Navy in 1892. And this is a time when the US Navy is building up, and will continue to do so until the late 1890s and in advance of the Spanish-American War. We don't have a photograph of William O. Golding, but I'm showing you an image here of two of his contemporaries, two young black young men, sailors who served aboard the USS Newark in 1898. So these young men would have been contemporaries of Golding when he was in the Navy. And we know that from his service record that he served for 10 years from 1892 to 1902. And again, as I mentioned, this was a time not only when the US Navy was building up, but you also had a number of African-American recruits for the Navy. In fact, in 1890, some 10% of Navy recruits were African-American young men. And so this is the world that Golding entered into. Perhaps he was seeking a more stable experience at sea, although the Navy was still not an easy place for a sailor during those times. And by the late 1890s, of course, the US was involved in other activities, including the Spanish-American War in Cuba, as well as military activity in the Philippines. And in a later census in 1930, where Golding appears as a patient at the US Marine Hospital, he is listed as a veteran of the Spanish-American War and the Philippine War. Now, he does indicate this military experience in some of his drawings, like the one we see on the right of the USS Texas, which was involved in the Spanish-American War in Cuba. Although the image that he gives us here is actually sort of an amalgam of two versions of the USS Texas, the one that served in the Spanish-American War and a later battleship of the First World War era. Now, speaking of the First World War, I mentioned that Golding left the Navy in 1902, but he did not, his experiences of war didn't end there. He later served as a merchant mariner, and he turns up in national news in 1917 during the First World War. He's serving on a ship called the Galena, which you see in the image on the left, a barkentine which had just delivered a supply of oil to Rouen, France. And on the way back to the US in the English Channel, hundreds of miles from Ushant, France, on the French side of the channel, his ship is captured and sunk by a German U-boat. And Golding is listed, as you can see there in the article on the lower right, among the survivors of the Galena. The Germans captured the ship, attached bombs to it, sank the ship, but allowed the crew to leave in lifeboats. The survivors were taken to Brest in France around the same time that American troops were landing there to serve in the First World War. You see that reflected in the headlines in the newspaper there. And we'll see later that he connects some of his drawings to this experience. Now, flash forwarding to 1930s Savannah. On the left, you see an image of the old United States Marine Hospital, which still stands today. It's a building that's currently operated by the Savannah College of Art and Design. But this was Savannah's Marine Hospital, where you would find merchant mariners, you would find veterans of the Navy and other seamen receiving treatment at the hospital. And we think Golding became a patient there around 1930. Some 18 months later, he meets the woman you see in the center of this image, Margaret Stiles, who is an art teacher, an artist from Savannah. She had taught at schools for girls here in Savannah, as well as in New Jersey. And in the 1930s, she was serving on Telfair Museum's board, actually, And she was doing outreach programs, outreach education programs, and she is said to have been a volunteer at the Marine Hospital. And so there she meets William O. Golding, is taken by his work, and begins to acquire his work, to buy work from him, as well as to sell work on his behalf to others in her circle and folks as far away as New York City. Also during the 1930s, late 1930s and into the early 1940s, Golding is visited by other family members, as you see on the right. Now, when he came back to Savannah, his parents, his adopted parents, had passed away, but he obviously kept in touch with family members, and his death certificate showed a sister, Sarah Quarterman, and there were other family members that we know of because his great grandniece was here just recently celebrating the opening of the exhibition with us. And her father, James Cleveland, is seen as a very young child here on the lap of his mother, Lily Mae Cleveland Cooper. And the two of them visited William O. Golding in the Marine Hospital. And young James was later influenced by his experience of meeting William O. Golding to join the Merchant Marine himself, and he encouraged his sons to do so as well. So there's this wonderful story of the continuation of a seagoing tradition in the family that continued on the basis of this young man hearing these exciting stories of a life at sea from Golding, who was there at the Marine Hospital, and family members remember him just being there in his hospital bed, drawing constantly, drawing all of the time. So let's take a look at his drawings. What are they like? What makes them special? So there are really kind of two major types of drawings that William O. Golding produced. And one type is the ship portrait, which you see here. On the left is a drawing by Golding of the steam yacht Norma Hall, which one account says that he may have served aboard at one point. And in this drawing, you'll notice that he notes in the border down at the bottom, the owner is John Jacob Astor, who famously went down on the Titanic. But this particular steam yacht actually resembles the ship that belonged to his son, Vincent Astor. And if you'll notice that image, we can compare it to another ship portrait by the Danish-American artist Antonia Jacobsen. And this is an example, the one on the right that you can find here in Savannah at the Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum. And it's a painting of the city, a ship called the City of Columbus. And you'll notice there are a lot of differences here. Golding did not have access to professional art training. He did not have access to nice art supplies. He did all of his drawings with very basic materials that were provided to him, things that were picked up at local dime stores, pads of paper, crayons, and pencils. And he did quite a bit with those limited materials and created these incredibly beautiful and complex drawings, like the one that you see on the left, in which you can see that the featured ship is much larger in scale than the other ships around it. But look at all of the other individual little ship portraits that appear around the Norma Hall, including in the background, there's a light ship, a light station, which is bears the name Jacksonville. So this might actually be depicting the Norma Hall cruising in our area. You'll also notice that Golding notes the name of the ship down at the bottom border, and he signs the work or includes his initials, the date, and he always includes his location of Savannah, Georgia. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the hallmarks of his work as we move along. But as I mentioned, ship portraits are one of the really significant parts of his work. And ship portraits were something that he could have seen quite easily over the course of his time spent at sea. He could have seen them in a captain's quarters or in shipping offices or in hotels catering to sailors, boarding houses. So ship portraits were very popular. There were prints of ship portraits as well as paintings. And so he likely saw these art forms. And he not only depicted ships that he could have seen in real life, but ships that he knew from history. And as a Navy man, he likely saw himself as part of this continuum and may have been very proud of his naval service. And so he depicts famous vessels from naval history. Now, the one on the left is a ship, the USS Constitution, or otherwise known as Old Ironside, which still exists today as a museum ship in Boston. And it is the oldest sailing warship still afloat. Now, this is a ship that had its heyday long before William O. Golding was born, most famously in the War of 1812. But William O. Golding could have easily seen this ship because the USS Constitution actually visited Savannah in 1931 on a post-restoration tour of the US. And it was actually towed into the Savannah Harbor, and there were crowds lined up on River Street to see the Constitution as it came to Savannah. So Golding could have easily seen that ship. We know he was in Savannah at the time. And on the right, you'll notice a drawing of another famous US warship, the USS Constellation, which saw a lot of service, but was noted actually for capturing slave ships and was part of the African slave trade patrol of the US Navy, and also was one of the ships on the hunt for Confederate raiders during the US Civil War. So this is a ship that was also very prominent in US history, another ship that still exists today as a museum ship. And Golding proudly includes the Great Seal of the United States in the bottom, the center of this drawing. Moving along, another one of the types of ship portraits that Golding depicts is the portrait of whaling ships. Now, he said he served on all kinds of ships, from a whaler to a man of war. He drew a number of whaling ships. He always indicates that these ships are in the Arctic Ocean. One of his drawings mentions North Cape, which could be a reference to Norway. So we don't know exactly where he might have been on a whaler, but often they have the same composition as you see here in this example. And Golding is really telling us a story here. He's combining different moments in time in the same image, things that would not have all been happening, if you snap the photograph of a whale hunt in progress, at the turn of the century or the 1890s, whenever this might have been happening. So if you look closely at this image, you'll notice, if you look at the upper left, the detail of the sailors up there on watch for whales, looking out for whales. At the same time, you'll notice the whale boats stowed on the ship, and at the same time they're being used in the hunt for whales. So different things that are happening, at different times are combined in the same image, things that you would not have seen altogether. And the composition here suggests scenes that were drawn by sailors, were inscribed by sailors on a whale tooth in the art of scrimshaw. So sailors' art forms like scrimshaw notations and whale book logs, other kinds of sailors' art forms like this may have influenced work like the one that we see here. There are some examples just to point those out. Scrimshaw, again, the upper right, the lower right, illustrations that you might have found in the log of a whale book. So we don't know for certain that Golding saw these things, but given the composition of this work, the way that he draws the whales, the way that he combines these moments in time, it's very reflective of these folk art forms practiced by sailors. Now, looking at this particular image, as I mentioned, Golding, drew steam yachts as well, in addition to whaling vessels and other sailing ships. He drew steam vessels, and on the left here, we see the steam yacht Viking, which is another steam yacht that he is said to have possibly served on. And this vessel belonged to a New York businessman named George Baker. And when we look at a steam yacht like this, I compare them to the oligarch mega yachts of today. They were quite elaborate vessels, very fancy, very lavishly outfitted in their interiors, and were really owned largely by the very wealthy, the wealthy industrialists and so on in the U.S. And so this drawing, we think, may have been a commission for the owner of this vessel, because there's a letter that traveled with this drawing when it was sold and resold, that was written by Margaret Stiles, the husband of Margaret Stiles' niece, who you see here on the right, Margaret Screven Duke. And the letter actually talks about, the businessman purchasing these pieces from Golding, 4 drawings from Golding. So again, Margaret Stiles and her family helped arrange sales for Golding, and he likely didn't get a whole lot of money out of it. It was described as sort of, pocket money for his luxuries, was the quote from this letter. So he did receive some money back for these sales of his work, and people knew about him. I've heard of other folks who visited him in the hospital to buy drawings from him, mostly folks who were artists or people who were in Margaret Stiles' circle. On the right, you see an image of Margaret Stiles' niece, Margaret Screven Duke, who's pictured here in Town and Country magazine in a fashion shoot in 1947. And look at what's behind her in that image. It's a whole wall filled with Golding's drawings. This is the first time that his work appeared in print that we know of. Sadly, William O. Golding was no longer around by this time. He had passed away in surgery at the Marine Hospital in 1943. And it would be quite a while before his work appeared in print again, a couple of decades plus before his work appeared in print again. Well, let's turn to some of the other work that he produced. And I mentioned earlier that, that he produced two major types of imagery, the ship portrait being one of those. The other one is the harbor view, or the port view. And here we have Golding's image of Canton, China, which he drew in 1935. And he did a number of drawings of Chinese ports, which seem to date to the 1890s. And these images hark back to earlier paintings of Chinese ports, many of them made by Chinese painters. In these locations, these ports that he depicted were largely the treaty ports that were set up by British and Western nations in these waterfront harbors during the 1840s and later, and were still in use throughout the late 19th century. And Golding apparently visited these many Chinese cities, perhaps during his time in the Navy during the 1890s. There's a possibility that, and going back to that image, sorry, on the very top edge of the image, you'll see a flag flying, a little yellow flag, and there's a blue dragon on that flag. And you'll see the same flag on a customs house on the right side. And this is the yellow dragon flag of the Qing dynasty, which would have been around that time that Golding was in the U.S. Navy. So these could indicate that he was there during that time. And if you look if you start plotting out these locations that he visited on a map, you'll see that he had he visited a lot of sites in the Atlantic, along the eastern seaboard of Canada and the United States, going all the way down to the tip of South America, Cape Horn, which he said he went around some 23 times. On the other side of the Atlantic, you have possibly whaling activity in the Arctic Circle, then moving on down to the English Channel, to the Rock of Gibraltar, down to St. Helena Island, and to Cape Town, South Africa, and Cape of Good Hope. And we know that he drew Cape Town, South Africa, for example. So this is a little snapshot of some of the locations he depicted that give us an idea of his travels in the Atlantic. On the other side of the world, his activities in the Pacific are a bit more limited. You really don't see him showing ports on the Pacific coast of the United States. You do have him out, showing showing Tahiti, for example, in the bottom right. You can see an image of Tahiti with these really fascinating depictions of not only sailing ships, Western sailing vessels, but Tahitian canoes. And colonial houses. So, Golding was really a witness to this sort of the colonialism of the day, to French colonies like Tahiti and what was then called French Indochina, present day Vietnam, and to these treaty ports in China. And he depicted numerous Chinese port cities, as you can see, the locations noted in the map on the left. And going to one of these images, I just wanted to kind of pick this apart for you a little bit and just show you the level of detail that he manages to pack into these small drawings. All of these are 9 by 12 inches. And as I mentioned, they're drawn with pencil and crayon on paper. So there's an incredible amount of detail he manages to pack into these images. So they really reward close viewing. Get up close to them and look at them and notice everything that's going on in them. This particular image showing Saigon, which he identifies as China, but of course is French Indochina of that period. What we have here, you'll see soldiers marching down the streets. You'll see others raising flags at a light station. You'll see American cruisers of the turn of the century coming into view from the lower right side, lower right corner. And there are French vessels coming in from the lower left corner. There are fortifications. There are some 19 different depictions of different types of vessels, from sailing ships to small rowboats indicated in this drawing. And the kinds of locations, the kind of businesses that he depicts are usually the places that would be of interest to a sailor. So he shows you boarding houses, bars, places where sailors would go for recreation. There's a ping pong parlor there. Other drawings show custom houses and churches. Particularly in the Chinese ports, you'll see Western churches. He'll depict those quite a bit. And he was said to be a deeply religious man. So that makes a lot of sense when you look at those images. Moving along to some of his wartime images, as I mentioned, he served for 10 years in the Navy, and reflections of war turn up in a number of his drawings, from an image of Fort Morgan in Alabama on the left, which was reactivated during the Spanish-American War and expanded during that time, to the image on the right showing the tugboat Dauntless, which was based in Savannah and in Jacksonville, Florida, and made national headlines ahead of the Spanish-American War, when it was illegally running guns to Cuban resistance fighters there. And you'll actually see this vessel flying the Cuban flag from its foremast. He also notes the captain of this vessel, Captain Floyd, who's an African-American tug captain, who was one of the crew making these making these illegal, what they were called was filibustering missions, delivering weapons and ammunition to Cuban resistance fighters. And then on the left, you see an image which we have not been able to locate, image of Cavite in the Philippines. And this points to Golding's service in the Philippine War. And this may depict the aftermath of the battle in Manila Bay between the US and Spanish forces there. The Spanish, of course, were defeated by then Admiral Dewey, and Golding even notes Dewey's HQ here in the upper right corner. He also made a drawing of Luzon Island in the Philippines, and the image on the right. And then moving closer to home, a number of Golding's drawings depict the Savannah Waterfront, and this would have been the environment that was most familiar to him. And these drawings show vessels that you would have easily seen on the Savannah River in the 1920s and 30s, including the tug William F. Macaulay, which was named for its owner, who later became president of the Savannah Bank and Trust Company. That building you also see in this image here in the center. And you'll notice a number of other Savannah landmarks in the image, like the Savannah Morning News Evening Press Building on the right side. There's the Crest department store on Broughton Street, seen a little further back. And on the left, interestingly, he includes the old Savannah City Exchange, which was long gone by the time he did this drawing. But that's the building that he would have seen sort of towering over the waterfront when he left Savannah as a child, but had been replaced by the current City Hall by the time that he returned to Savannah, or was in the process of being replaced at that time. A couple of other images of a vessel that he also might have seen here on the waterfront, the USS Tybee, which was the United States Coast Guard launch of the period. The drawing on the left is from the Morris Museum in Augusta. And if you'll notice the upper right of that drawing, you'll see what's now Plant Riverside indicated there. So again, these were, he's including landmarks, Savannah landmarks in these images. You'll also see the Tybee here indicated not in the Savannah port in the image on the right. And then a couple of more vessels that he could have seen on the Savannah waterfront, the SS Pilot Boy, the image on the left from the Morris Museum, and that is a passenger steamboat that ran between Savannah and Charleston. And I love the little slogan here, fast service, Savannah to Charleston. And there are some wonderful little details, people having conversations aboard the vessel there. On the right is the USS, or the, actually it's the Isendaga. He calls it the Isendaga, but this was a US Army inspection yacht operated by the predecessor of the what became the US Army Corps of Engineers. And you can see the Corps of Engineers logo on the funnel of this ship on the right side there. And you'll see other Savannah businesses in the background, the Savannah Hotel, Savannah Ships Chandlery, and the Morning News building again on the right side. And he did numerous drawings of this particular vessel. So I think this one had particular significance to him. Not all of his drawings were as tied to reality, however, as his drawings of Savannah. This particular image of Cape Horn is really sort of mythic, and it includes a sailing ship sailing around the Horn here in the upper right, and a steamship coming around here in the foreground. And Cape Horn, we have to remember, he claimed to have gone around it some 23 times. This was the most feared passage on the planet, and was really the only way, the main way to get from one ocean to the other. If you were transporting goods, or if you were in the Navy getting from one ocean to the other, you had to sail around Cape Horn. It was very treacherous. Many ships were lost there. And Golding makes this scene seem almost cheerful by his inclusion of things that maybe didn't exist on the tip of Cape Horn, like the Cape Horn post office, which may have been a myth that was spread among sailors to sort of ease the pain of making this very treacherous passage. But I love the details in this work. To look at all of the individual images of people, of animals, the whales here in the foreground. Beautiful, wonderful image. And you'll notice that there's a symbol here in the upper right side, this sunburst. And you may have seen this in most of the drawings that I showed today, including this wonderful image, which is in Telfair Museum's collection. Now that image of the sun is really important. It's really his personal symbol. And it has special significance to sailors as well. It's not just the sun. He's combining the sun with a compass rose, or a mariner's compass that you would have seen on a ship's compass or on nautical charts or maps. So this is an invention that Golding applies to all of his drawings, or almost all of his drawings. And it's really this personal symbol. And you see that it changes form over the course of time, from his early drawings from the early 1930s to his late drawings from around 1939. And so the compass rose is also a tattoo that some sailors get as a reminder of their way home. And so this might have had a symbolic meaning for Golding as well, as being sort of a personal symbol for him that he applies to almost all of his work. Now, personal symbolism is no more evident than in this particular work, which is the last image I'm going to show today. And this is a truly stunning drawing. It's not the most colorful piece he did, but I think it's one of the most astonishing ones, because this is a vessel that he names after himself. This is a ship which he names the William O. Golden. And again, he went by both names. In public life, he went by the surname Golding. In private life, and to his family, he was known as Golden. So here he is naming this ship after himself. And he includes little references to himself throughout the image, including his initials. You'll find his initials and different versions of his name everywhere in the image, including in the signal flags up here. And he has autobiographical details, like this military installation on the upper left, and a little pagoda in the background, perhaps referencing his time spent in China. And I think most amazing of all, take a look at the figurehead of this vessel. If we look at this particular detail, I think we're looking at William O. Golding. He included this figurehead, which I think is a self-portrait. We don't have a photograph of him, sadly, and this may be the only image that we have of him. And he frequently drew these figurative elements in his work. He drew these figureheads showing men, women, sometimes animals. But in this case, I think he's showing us himself, because he places the figurehead right under his name. And you'll see the two different spellings of his name on the ship and here in the signature on the lower left. So I'm going to leave you with that image and ask you to think a bit about the incredible achievements of this man, who was based right here in Savannah, Georgia. He's, I think, one of the most amazing artists the city has ever seen. And his work is really now just getting some national attention. And we hope that that will continue through this exhibition that's currently up at the museum, and will travel to Augusta, Georgia, possibly other locations in the future, as well as a new book that we've just produced, the first book ever devoted to his work. So with that, I'll say thank you.
It was great, Harry. I mean, it's really a fascinating story, and his work is fascinating, so detailed. There's so much to see in it. I'm wondering if you might maybe speak a little bit about what it means to have an exhibition of his work like this, and a publication too. What it means to kind of put William O. Golding on a stage like this finally.
Yeah, well, this has been a pet project of mine for some 20 years. When I started working on him, we did not have a single image of his work in a collection in Savannah or even Georgia. And since that time, both the Morris Museum and Telfair museums have acquired collections of his work. But Golding's story, I think, is a really important one. Again, we have very few stories like this, very few bodies of artwork produced by African-American sailors at all, and so it's a really important documentation of his experiences, even though his work includes elements of myth and imagination as well. But his work connects to history in so many ways. I mean, his father, being one of the original 33 Black lawmakers in the state of Georgia, his presence in the U.S. Navy during this really crucial period, which is really when America begins to assert itself on the world stage. He was a witness to, colonialism and imperialism and to war and to all of these world-changing events of his time. And, it's an incredible life story, an incredible experience. And so if we don't remember artists like this, who will? I mean, if we don't tell his story, who will? It's important, I think, that folks understand the kinds of, hardships and lives that folks like Golding went through. It was a very difficult life for a sailor, of any kind back at, in the 19th century. Sailors had absolutely no rights. And so he talks about hard knocks and hardships, and that was the absolute truth. It was a really difficult life to lead.
Yeah. I have so many questions. I probably just need to come to see the exhibit and look at the book. I mean, starting with basically a child being kidnapped and taken from his family, and his family probably having so many questions about what has happened to their child.
Exactly, yeah.
I think there's, so much to learn about him and his life. But so I really enjoy you basically giving us a little taste and encouraging us all to learn more about him and his work and his life. So thank you so much. And I hope everybody will come and see the exhibit while it's up.
And you can see other examples of his work on Telfair Museum's website as well, telfair.org. We have all 23 images from the museum's collection, which are, if you look at our collection section and search him, you can find a number of his works there.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this terrific artist.